I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 16th video discussing 1950s British science fiction paperbacks. Now for this video, I'm going slightly off the track in that not all of the books are science fiction, but they're all fantastic and they're all fantasy and they're all collected by science fiction collectors, as will become clear. Now then, in 1949, the publishing firm of Mark Golden, whose books were distributed by an established publisher, W.H. Allen, began issuing the first mass-market paperback editions of Edgar Rice Burroughs in Britain. And they were an instant success. They sold in the tens of thousands. Now, I'm just showing here the first 10 titles, but there were to be over 40 titles in the next few years, right through to 1958, with a short break in between. And unprecedented for publishing in the post-war period, these titles were frequently reprinted. They were sold out, so they reprinted them, sometimes with a new cover, sometimes reprising the cover, but they're detectable as reprints because they have more titles on the back cover than the first edition had. And they were an unprecedented success. And the mushroom publishers in England in 1950 became very envious of the sales of these titles, and they decided that they would jump on the bandwagon and do some Tarzan imitations. Now, these books were largely unknown until the late 1990s, when I was the first person to draw attention to them as a group and to explain that there were precisely 30 British imitation Tarzan titles issued between 1951 and 1953. And that is the subject of this video. First off the mark was the most rapacious of the mushroom publishers, Curtis Warren. They commissioned their staff writer, David Griffiths, to come up with a British Tarzan. And he came up with Tarzan. And the publishers blurbed it, as you can see, in the 6 titles they put out in short order, is Tarzan the Ape Man. And you can see the character here. It's obviously Tarzan, but the publishers miscalculated. Tarzan the Ape Man was such a blatant rip-off of Tarzan, the Tarzan of the Apes, that Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. In America immediately began litigation, and they slapped an injunction on Curtis Warren for blatant imitation. And these books had to be withdrawn and all stocks of them destroyed. In point of fact, only about 2/3 of them were destroyed, fortunately, obviously, as you can see here. But as a result of this, the Tarzan books are extremely rare. Now, the books themselves, although they were based on Tarzan, they were quite a good variation, and they weren't plagiarisms of the text. It was the presentation that put the markers on it. Now, today, this series of Tarzan books, the 6 titles, are perhaps the 6 most valuable books to collectors. And Americans in particular go crackers to obtain their sets of the Tarzan. Now then, as I said, they had to be withdrawn from sale. Now the other publishers were watching, including Skyen, and Skyen wanted to get in on the act. They saw what had happened to Curtis Warren, because they were too blatant an imitation. So they commissioned their star writer, John Russell Fearn, to do a tryout of two novels, You can see them there, Gold of Akada and Anjani the Mighty, with their version of Tarzan, but they didn't call him Tarzan, they called him Anjani. And there was no mention of the 8 men, so they got away with it. And of course, Fern was such a skillful writer that he was able to infuse his own brand of plotting into these books, and he came up with the ingenious idea of a British explorer and his wife in the jungle searching for the lost city of Okada, fabled to have lots of gold and jewels and so on. While they were hunting for it in the jungle, the lost city, when they're set upon by natives and they're actually killed. But his wife has just had twin babies, and the babies are kidnapped by the natives and they're separated. One baby goes with one tribe and another baby goes with the other tribe. And the two British babies actually grow up unaware of each other. And at maturity, they're very intelligent and they actually become the leaders of their respective tribes. And the narrative that's continued, it's one continuous story in 2 books, describes what happens after the twins became aware of each other and become deadly rivals. And it's an action-packed romp. It's written in the Burroughs style, which is that they have two sets of characters, and say the hero and the heroine. And Burroughs' technique, which was very successful, was to have them get separated, and then they would just describe the action of one, they would reach another crisis, and then Burroughs would cut to the scene of the second character, and you would alternate back and forward between them. And it made for a very fast reading and enjoyable pulp adventure. But Fern was unhappy doing the books, and Skyen realised that they were much better off having him to continue to write science fiction, because that was a bestseller. And although these 2 books sold very well, they didn't sell quite as well as his science fiction. So after 2 books, the Anjani series came to an end. Now then, we see here another publisher, Harborough. They got in on the act, but instead of having a Tarzan character, they had a woman, Shuna, White Queen of the Jungle. So that eliminated any possibility of getting sued by Edgar Rice Burroughs. But in point of fact, they could have faced a lot of trouble, because Shuna was a rip-off of another American fiction character called Sheena. Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, had her own pulp magazine, but she wasn't as well known as Tarzan. Now then, these 2 books, although the byline John King, this was a pseudonym for Ernest McKeague, who was a veteran British writer, but he was a writer of juvenile stories. He was, in fact, at the time, the editor for Amalgamated Press, the leading publisher of boys' comics and boys' story papers. And these 2 stories, they're pretty terrible. They're juvenile. They're full of stock juvenile characters, juvenile plotting. And this book, Shuna and the Lost Tribe, is particularly ridiculous. It concerns the Shuna is the White Queen of a lost race living on a plateau, a hidden plateau in Brazil. And she rules over a tribe of pygmies, and she has a pet leopard, as you can see there. And in the second book, it's so ridiculous. An asteroid crashes into the Earth, a rogue asteroid enters the solar system out of nowhere, heads straight for the Earth, crashes into it and slices off the top of the plateau in Brazil and takes it piggyback back into space. Of course, in astronomical reality, an asteroid smashing into the Earth would be like an atom bomb going off. But the Shuna and the people and the plateau and the heroes and his companions are carried off into space on this asteroid, where they have ridiculous juvenile adventures combating giant beetle men and God knows what else, and it's just too ridiculous for words. So these two are the worst of the entire series of jungle adventures, of Burroughs imitations, the worst written, but paradoxically, they're also the most famous and the most collectible on account as the cover artwork was by the famous artist Reg Heed, who was legendary in the illustration field, especially on paperback books, and he's avidly collected today. And any book, any vintage paperback with a Heed cover is worth at least £50 and a lot more in this case. These are 3-figure books. They don't deserve to be, but because of their rarity and because of Heed, they are. But in point of fact, as Michael Caine would say, not many people know that the great Reg Heed, famous artist, here is exposed as a plagiarist. You can see from this American magazine cover, the Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, Shuna, Queen of the Jungle, that's an obvious rip-off, but you can see the cover is just a mirror image of the same image. You have the girl in the leopard skin bathing suit with a knife, threatened by a big cat extending its claw in the bough of a purple tree with green leaves. There's no getting away from it. This cover, which was published in November 1951, was a complete rip-off of this American magazine, which was in spring 1951, 6-7 months before. Now, all I can think of is that Heed was such a brilliant artist that he must have been ordered by the publisher and given a copy of this, and he was under instructions to copy it. You can see here that Heed's artwork, the skin tones on the girl and the realistic cat, are actually much better than this Alan Anderson cover on the American. It's a much better cover, but it is a plagiarism. Now you remember that Sky and it terminated their successful Jungle series after 2 issues at Fern's request, but they also knew that they had a ready-made replacement lined up, and this was Victor Norwood, and he had created his own Tarzan, which was called Jakari. But Jakari wasn't an African Tarzan. They weren't set in the jungles of Africa, but they were set in the Mato Grosso area in Brazil. They were set in the jungles of South America. So they were sufficiently different from Tarzan, who operated out of Africa, to be safe from prosecution. Now, these books are also very collectible, not least because of the outstanding artwork by Ron Turner. These are Ron Turner covers, absolutely beautiful. In fact, this cover is so good that Turner signed it, something he hardly ever did unless he was absolutely personally satisfied with the cover. It's very rare to see a Turner signature on a 1950s book, and this is one of them. This book here, The Island of Creeping Death, is by another very famous artist, not by Turner, it's by Micklewright. Now, Micklewright was a veteran artist, and this was one of his last covers before he died. but he'd been very famous throughout the 30s and 40s, and it's a shame that he didn't do more covers for Sky, and that's his only cover. And the remaining Jakari novel has a much inferior cover, as does the last book. Now, this last book, the other books are all feature Jakari, but the 7th title is just a straight, a one-off adventure set in the jungle, part of the Jungle series, but it doesn't feature Jakari. Now, Norwood was a strange character. He was reputedly 6'6", huge build, had been a wrestler and a boxer at one time, and a jack of all trades. He travelled all around the world, did all sorts of jobs, but in particular, he was actually a jungle explorer in real life. He'd led expeditions to South America, searching for diamonds. Straight out of a pulp plot, one of his a dying friend had passed to him a map of a sort of a cache of diamonds in the heart of the jungle in South America, and he went to try and locate it. So these books are actually packed with lots of authentic detail of the South American jungles, all the plants, exotic vegetation, the animals, the flesh-eating fish in the river, and so on and so forth. So they're very colourful, and they're action-packed, and they're great fun. The only thing about them is they're rather heavy on violence. They're really they're a bit too much. All the characters get killed and dismembered and ripped to pieces by animals and captured by the natives and tortured and so on. It's all a bit much. So you can only sort of read one book at a time. If you tried to read them all, you'd get indigestion. And they're also very titillating as well. But they're very unusual, and they were very successful. And today, they're very highly collected and valued. Now, this last title you see here is awful. It's the dreaded firm of John Spencer, who at the lower end of the pulp publishers, they only paid half the rates of everybody else, and most of their stuff was bottom end. And this particular book by the pseudonymous John Raymond is absolutely awful. In fact, the cover for that, if we just hang on a minute, we'll see where that cover comes from. Bear with me. Here it is. It's a rip-off of the Curtis Warren Tarzan cover. And it's a very forgettable novel. But undeservedly, because it's so rare, and because it completes everybody's set of the Tarzan books, it's on every collector's wants list. It's an undeserved collector's item, and it's an absolute disgrace, but it's part of the British Tarzans, so everybody wants to have it. Now then, you remember that Curtis Warren had been heavily fined or whatever, when an injunction was taken against him by Edgar Rice Burroughs and had to cease the Marco O'Garan series. Now, they had a reflection on it, and they took the lesson to heart that they're too blatant an imitation, but they still wanted to get in on the act because the Edgar Rice Burroughs was still popular in Britain. So they came up with another cunning wheeze, and this was to get Dennis Hughes to switch from writing science fiction for them to pen a new series of jungle adventures. And Hughes's character, who you see illustrated here by the talented artist Terry Maloney, was in fact a white hunter. He wasn't a Tarzan, he wasn't a physical Superman, he was just an experienced white hunter. He was also a bit of a scientist and a geologist to aid in the plot developments. So they changed the spelling of Garin, which was a double R, to a single R, and there was a 12-book series, which you see all the titles here, were by Dennis Hughes, on the jungle adventures set in Africa of a big game hunter, Rex Brandon, and he was also a geologist and an explorer. And Hughes' ingenuity knew no bounds. As you can see from the various covers here, he covered all sorts of jungle adventures, and he also brought in the occasional sort of lost race element from Burroughs and the sort of lost tribes and so on. And there were sparkling adventure stories written in his best fast-paced style, and they were very successful. They ran for 12 books. But the last book is the only book not set in Africa. It is in fact set in the Yukon, because as a geologist, sometimes Rex Brandon accepts assignments abroad, you know, looking for rare minerals and uranium and so on, and gold. In this novel has adventures in Canada. Now then, after the 12 books, Hughes' science fiction became so popular, as I mentioned in an earlier video, he had this new slant of science fantasy, and his science fantasy books became bestsellers. So the series came to an end after 12 books, very successful. Today, possibly because of the Mark O'Garan connection, the people who collect the first 6 Mark O'Garan Tarzan books also want to collect this sort of follow-up series. And these books are very rare. I looked on Abe Books just before I made this video, and there's only one book out of the 12 currently on offer anywhere in the world, and that was priced at £50. Now, all of these 30 British Tarzans that I've been talking about are fantastically rare and are usually priced as at least at £50 each, and frequently a hell of a lot more when they're offered, which is rarely. But as an agent, I have been able to get a few of my own client titles reprinted in recent years, and here we see these reprinted editions. The Gold of Akada and Anjani the Mighty. These two were a very limited small press edition published by Gary Levise's Griffin Books in 1998, with new front covers by Ron Turner. The old covers were reprinted on the back, which is quite neat. Many copies of these unfortunately were destroyed by Hurricane Sandy when the publisher's house was flooded, but you may be lucky enough to find a copy or two at around £20. These two are future collector's items. The Gold of Akada and Return to Akada, the Gold of Akada and a Return to Akada were reprinted by Ulverscraft in their large print Linford Mystery series. The second Anjani book was retitled. Long out of print, but cheap ex-library copies might still be found on Abe Books, though I expect not for very much longer. Now here we see the latest and I think the best editions of The Gold of Akada and Anjani the Mighty. They were both published by Wildside with reprinted Turner covers. They're still in print and available at £10 to £15, an absolute bargain. Now the remaining 4 books you see here, Death Warriors, Jungle Quest, aka Jungle Allies, Mountain Gold and Bush Claws. These are just 4 of Dennis Hughes's 12 Rex Brandon titles, published in the Linford Mystery Series, large print, before they were spooked by some idiot complaining, falsely, that they were politically incorrect. They're out of print, but cheap ex-library copies might still be found on e-books, although, as I've already warned you, not for very much longer. However, the great news is that Rich Harvey's Bold Venture Press in the United States has contracted with me to publish all 12 Rex Brandon adventures later this year in their attractive double novel editions. That's something to watch out for.